Welcome to our Wednesday Bible study, where we are going to be looking at our third week in the book of Romans. If this is your first time with us, we're glad to have you. Hope you get a lot out of it. Every week up to this, we're going by verse, is on our website and on our YouTube channel where you're currently at. So by all means, go back and watch the others, but you should be able to follow along with us if you're jumping in right here. So all that being said, let's recap really quickly what we've covered so far. Anytime we read any part of Scripture, there's three things we need to know. You need to know who wrote it, who they're writing to, and why. We call that author, audience, agenda, if you like alliterations as much as I do. And so the author of the letter of Romans is Paul the Apostle. He's dictating the letter to a person named Tertius, and it is being delivered and preached by a person named Phoebe. The audience is the church in Rome, a mixed congregation of both Gentile and Jewish congregants who are living at the center of the world, basically, in the most powerful city on the planet, right under the nose, quite literally, of the most powerful person on the planet, Emperor Nero. And the agenda is he's writing to provide a definitive gospel. Paul's writing to make sure, hey, this is the true gospel. Anything outside of this that deviates from this, it's got to agree with it. Otherwise, it's not the true gospel. So he's giving them a solid foundation that they can always use and reference when it comes to questions of faith and theology. And also, he's writing to prepare them for their visit, to try to preemptively do some pastoral work and prepare them for his visit, to get the most out of his time and to maybe handle some issues that he hears them having. Last week, Paul talked about the gospel itself. He kind of laid down the foundation from which he's going to launch into the rest of this letter. And so he spells out the gospel itself, but we also saw that the gospel was not just a thing, that he spells it out in a way that was very political and charged. You know, he references Jesus as Lord, as the Son of God, and those are political terms for the emperor. Like they were things that it was a very politically worded writing. So he starts out the letter by kind of laying down that, hey, just because Rome is so powerful and great, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are the true center of the world. That's this Jesus guy. And so he concluded with verse 13. That's where we left off last week. So I'll read that, and then we'll read today's section. So Romans chapter 1, verse 13, it says, "I don't want you to be unaware, my dear family, that I've often made plans to come to you. It's just that up to now, something has always got in the way. I want to bear some fruit among you, as have been doing among other nations." And then today's section, starting in verse 14, and we'll go all the way to 23. It says, "I am under obligation to Greeks and barbarians alike, you see, both to the wise and to the foolish. That's why I'm eager to announce to you the good news in Rome. I'm not ashamed of the good news. It's God's power bringing salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also equally to the Greek. This is because God's covenant justice is unveiled in it, from faithfulness to faithfulness. As it says in the Bible in Habakkuk, the just shall live by faith. For the anger of God is unveiled from heaven against all the ungodliness and injustice performed by people who use injustice to suppress the truth. What can be known of God, you see, is plain to them, since God has made it plain to them. There are, of course, things about God which you can't see, namely his eternal power and deity. But ever since the world was created, they had been known and seen in the things he has made. As a result, they have no excuse. They knew God, but didn't honor him as God or thank him. Instead, they learned to think in useless ways, and their unwise heart grew dark. They declared themselves to be wise, but in fact they became foolish. They swapped the glory of the immortal God for the likeness of the image of mortal humans and of birds and animals and reptiles. God, please be with the study today. Let us see your word a little bit clearer. Let us understand your word a little bit more and draw us ever further into knowledge of you. All these things in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. So, big picture. Verses 1 through 14, we're going to kind of separate it like that. We'll do verses 14 through 17 and then 18 through 23. So looking at that first section, we see that Paul kind of is talking really, really big. Like if you step back and look at this line by line, it is incredibly dense. There's a lot here. He introduces a lot of topics that he's going to spend chapters discussing. So we aren't going to go too deeply into these, but just know that You could spend a lot of time just breaking down the subject Paul talks about here, kind of summarizing it all. Paul is explaining in further detail, why he wants to visit Rome, right? This is kind of his motivation. It's part of his job to bring the gospel to all peoples, both Gentiles and Jewish peoples. He says that the gospel is for everyone. He doesn't need to be ashamed of it because it's God's power to save people. And it does this by unveiling God's justice, God's age-old plan to put the world and human beings to rights, as Dr. N.T. Wright says. That he's talking that this whole section, this little itty bitty section, as densely packed as it is, it's there. It's him kind of saying, "Hey, this is what I'm called to do. This is what I have to do, and this is what happens when I do it." Like that's essentially what he's saying. That when I'm called to be an apostle, that means I share the good news with people who are far from Christ, right? And when I do, it brings about salvation, and salvation not just because they get saved, but because God calls them to a whole new level, and justice is brought about, and yada 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 yada. It's a massively dense couple sentences. And so let's just look at a few things here that aren't really covered as much later. First thing that you see, you might be wondering why he would ever be ashamed of the gospel, right? Why would he be ashamed of preaching the gospel? Like, I understand like there might be some differences of opinions. People may disagree, but if he believes it, why would he be ashamed of it? Now, I grew up in Southeast Ohio, if you're unaware. I was born in Huntington, West Virginia, raised on the Ohio side of the river in Gallipolis, and then I've lived in Kentucky pretty much ever since going to college. But growing up in that small Ohio River town, everybody was an Ohio State fan. Everybody. I mean, it was just that was the culture there. That was what you did. It seems like in the fall during football season, like the rhythm of the town was built around when Ohio State was playing. Like I distinctly remember times when, if Ohio State was playing that team up north, or it was a national title game, like the town would shut down. Like you couldn't do anything. Like if you went into a store, all the clerks were watching the game. Like if you needed help, you better wait till a timeout. Like that was the only way you could get help. Like Ohio State was the dominant thing in that town growing up for large portions of my life. It just, everybody loved Ohio State. To root for another college football team was just... it was heresy. Like, how could you? Ohio State was the best team ever. If you rooted for another team and you were from there, you pretty much could expect near constant harassment about your choice of college football team. The bottom line was Ohio State was the best football program in the world, and anyone who said otherwise was probably a terrorist who hated America, at least according to Ohio State fans. Now, the thing was, the entire worldview of people back then, I don't think it's like this as much now. I'm definitely not now. I don't watch college sports at all, really. But it was that was the most important thing in their lives. It was like, why would you root for anybody else? You have Ohio State. Your home team is Ohio State. It's the best football team, most successful football team, blah, 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 blah. All the reasons that Ohio State fans would give. And so when Paul says in verse 16 that he's not ashamed of the gospel, think of him like somebody who's a Michigan fan, proudly wearing their U of M jersey every single Saturday in the fall, right? Everybody around him is like, Rome is the center of the world. Rome is the bee's knees. Rome is the greatest ever. Why would you root for anybody? Why would you want anybody but the emperor to be king of the world? Why would you want to be a citizen of any other nation, any other country, any other empire? Why would you want anything besides Rome? And Paul, in his proud jersey, is walking around going, yeah, no, there's a different king. I'm part of a different kingdom, and it's much better than Rome, right? The dominant worldview of the Romans was that Rome was the best thing ever, that anyone who said anything otherwise, the way Paul has very definitely said thus far, they should be ashamed of themselves. But Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Jesus is king of the world. Every knee will bow. He says that in his Philippians letter. Like every knee will bow to this king, including the emperor of Rome. So he's essentially like he's calling Rome out again. Like Paul is not pulling punches in this letter. Like he is saying, hey, yeah, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's true. It's real, and I absolutely will wave that flag proudly. I will wear the gospel jersey 24/7. I don't care who sees it. I'm not going to be ashamed of the gospel. And in this, like, the more you dig into this, the more you realize, like, Paul really is a type A personality. Like, he is not afraid of conflict at all. He knows he's right, and he's very comfortable telling you he's right. And how do I know this? Verse 14, look at it. You might see it and be like, oh, I don't see anything. He talks about Greeks and barbarians, that he brought the gospel to them. if you step back for a second and think about, all right, how does the Bible normally divide up peoples, right? It's normally they divide them along one group versus another, right? Jews and Gentiles, or the nations, or the Greeks. They all mean the same thing, but usually that's the distinction, right? You have Gentiles, people who are not Jewish, and Jewish people. That's how the Bible normally does it. But Paul here says Greeks and barbarians. This is a direct shot across the bow at Rome, because back a couple centuries earlier, Greek was the dominant empire, right? Greece, not Greek. Greece was the dominant empire. You had Alexander the Great do his thing. You had you had Greek colonies everywhere. Like, Greece was the dominant people group of the Mediterranean. And the way they divided up the world was Greeks and barbarians. They said everybody who doesn't speak Greek sounds like they're going blah, 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 blah. And so barbarian is actually, it's the word that sounds like the sound, right? An onomatopoeia. Barbarians. And so what Paul is doing is he's saying, yeah, I'm supposed to bring the gospel to these Greeks and barbarian Romans. The Romans are lumped into the barbarians the way the Greeks would have a couple centuries earlier. Paul was teasing the Romans, lumping them into this barbarian category. What Paul was saying is essentially that he is under obligation to share the gospel with these barbarian Romans as well. And then after that, Paul actually divides up everything the way the Bible normally does. He talks about, the gospel was revealed, the truth was revealed to the Jews first, but then also to everybody else equally, by the way. He adds that in there, that it's not the Jews have priority, it's just they got it first, but it's equally given to everyone. He said the gospel brings about salvation to the Jews first, then to everyone else. And the thing is, we're going to dig a lot more into that later, because Paul spends chapters talking about the status of the Jewish peoples and the Gentiles peoples, and how they're this new thing, and the way God views the Gentiles and the Jews. So we're not going to dig into that here. But the thing is, it all comes down to building faith. He says this over. He says belief and faith. And when you read Paul using those words, he almost uses them interchangeably, but they don't mean what we typically think of belief and faith. Because typically you hear that and you think just mental acknowledgement of it, right? I believe Jesus is the Messiah. That's great. So do the demons, right? Like that's not what he's talking about. He uses a word here that's very specific, that it's closer to the way somebody who truly loves their king supports their king and lives their lives, right? If a king gives issued a command, a loyal subject will carry that out, right? So this word, this belief, this faithfulness unto faithfulness, it's talking about loyalty, it's talking about obedience, and it's talking about belief, right? So belief is part of it, but it's not all of it. It's everything. And again, we're going to talk about that more here in several chapters as well. So that's kind of where we're going to leave this first section. Let's look at the second section. Let's read it again to make sure we're on the same page. Starting in verse 18, it says, "For the anger of God is unveiled from heaven against all the ungodliness and injustice performed by people who use injustice to suppress the truth. What can be known of God, you see, is plain to them, since God has made it plain to them. There are, of course, things about God which you can't see, namely his eternal power and deity. But ever since the world was created, they have been known and seen in the things he has made. As a result, they have no excuse. They knew God, but didn't honor him as God or thank him. Instead, they learned to think in useless ways, and their unwise heart grew dark. They declared themselves to be wise, but in fact they became foolish. They swapped the glory of the immortal God for the likeness of the image of mortal humans, and of birds and animals and reptiles." The study we did before this was we did our summer study, which was just kind of a here and there, a little bit of everywhere study. But before that, we'd studied the book of James. And if you went through that with us, you'll remember that James used kind of an analogy of a doctor diagnosing a disease. That you see the symptoms, all these problems, things like favoritism, sexual immorality, greed, backstabbing, murder, fighting, all these different things, gluttony, drunkenness, like these are symptoms for the disease of not being wise, of not taking God's wisdom, applying it correctly to your life as a means to allow God to work out his will in your life, right? That we talked about all the way through that. That the lack of wisdom was the disease that was causing all of these symptoms, and James keeps pointing back to that over and over. Well, throughout the book of Romans, we're going to see Paul has a similar type of thinking, that there are problems that show up amongst Christians, and they all come back to this same disease. And the disease that Paul points at is rebellion. Rebellion against God. That's the disease he points at. Really, it's the other side of the same coin as not using wisdom, as being unwise, right? That you are rebelling against God. But the thing is, we want to make sure we understand what he means by rebellion. Because here Paul is introducing an idea that's going to go for a while, that he's going to talk about it for quite a bit. So over the next couple of weeks, it's kind of going to be the center of what we're talking about. So as we are introduced to this idea, let's make sure we understand it. So humanity's rebellion against God is kind of like the rot of a tree, right? If a tree gets a disease in its roots, it doesn't just like the whole tree at once get sick, right? It starts underground where you can't see it, and it travels from the roots to the inside of the tree, and then it rots the tree from the inside out. And so when one of these trees is cut down, you won't notice it at first probably until it falls down, right? If it gets that sick. But if you see it and you cut it down beforehand, the inside of this tree will probably be hollow. Things look like they're fine on the outside, but on the inside, they're rotten and empty, slowly dying. That's what rebellion does against God. It rots us from the inside out. And so what is rebellion against God? Now, the way I like to think about it is through my own lens of my own two kids, right? I have two boys. They are ornery as all get out. And they come by it honestly, right? Like this, they didn't like just, it's so weird. They're like this. Like, no, like they're just like their mother and father. They are ornery and they come by it honestly. They misbehave. They do things I tell them not to do, and they don't do the things I do tell them to do. They're ornery. They're boys, right? They're 4 and 7. That's what they do. They're kids. They are fantastic kids, right? They are, like, I could not be more proud of these boys. They are so great. They're so smart. They're so funny. They're so caring and kind and compassionate. I can't say enough good things about my boys. They drive me nuts, but I can't say enough good things about them. They are great kids. But just because they mess up, just because they disobey, just because they do things they shouldn't or they don't do things they should, that doesn't mean they're rebelling against me, right? Again, they're too young. They're not teenagers. Right? They're kids. Just because they mess up or do the wrong thing or don't do the right thing, that doesn't mean they're living in rebellion against their parents. It just means they're kids. It means they made a mistake. We sometimes make that same error when it comes to our thinking about being in rebellion against God. Sometimes we think that if we make a mistake or we don't do what we should or we do something that we shouldn't, that we're now in rebellion against God. And it doesn't exactly work like that, because as long as you're a repentant Christian who sees the error of your ways, is constantly trying to weed out sin from your life, that's not living in rebellion. Yes, sin is rebellion, but not all sin causes your heart to be in rebellion as long as you are repentant about it. We all sin every single day. Everybody who calls on the name of Christ. We make mistakes. We don't do what we should, and we do things that we shouldn't. Paul himself says that later in this book. Again, a lot of topics we're going to dig into for a long time. But the point here is that the rebellion, sinning in your life does not necessitate you are living in rebellion. Sin is rebellion. But as long as you are repentant, you're not living in rebellion. I hope that makes sense. Again, we're going to talk about it more here in a little bit. But Paul says what really truly makes somebody rebellious against God is their thinking. He says in verse 21 that rebellion against God starts with useless thinking and results in darkened hearts. Proverbs 4:23 says it like this: above everything that you keep watch over, preserve your mind, because from it things go out into life. Think about it like this, right? Paul makes this argument this way. Think about archaeology. Archaeology is the study of physical evidence, for the most part, from people groups of the past, right? There are some modern day archaeologists, people who are documenting, current active people groups. For the most part, archaeology deals with people groups who are no longer around, because you can't ask them questions. They're not actively there, right? And so when an archaeologist looks at a site, they study buildings, they study artifacts, they study pottery and books and anything they can find. They look at all these different things, and they piece together an idea about who this people group was, right? We can't ask them anymore because they're gone, but we can still learn a lot based on what they left behind, on the things they created. Paul is making the argument that God made creation, it kind of points to some ideas about who God is. He says in this section that, yeah, there are some things that you can't see from creation, things like his deity, things like all those kind of things, those intangible things. But if you look at creation, it points to a God. I mean, most scientists agree. Well, I can't say most because I don't have research to back that up, but I hear a lot of scientists say that if you truly study the origin of the universe and you look at the breakdown of it, it screams that there had to be intelligent design behind it. My point here is that creation points to God. So Paul makes the argument that, hey, creation itself points to an intelligent designer, right? It points to a creator the same way evidence archaeologists study point to the people group that made it. And I don't know how many times I've heard people say that the closest they've been to God or where they truly feel God's presence is when they're out in nature. The beauty of nature reflects the Creator. And there are things about God that we simply can't know, like I said, as Paul said. But the thing is, a lot of people will mistake creation for the Creator, or at least they did. We still do, but it looks a little bit different nowadays, and we'll talk about that more here in the next few chapters. But it's that brokenness of thinking that Paul points to. Rebellion is learning to think in ways that rejects the truth for a lie. Essentially, that's what rebellion does. Rebellion looks at creation and says, I choose to ignore the evidence, and instead I'm going to make myself the center of my universe, or I'm going to make this false God the center of my universe. In today's world, we don't carve little statues of monkeys and dragons and say, this is our God. No, we take the dollar bill, we take fame, we take fortune, we take wealth, we take success, we take all these different things, we take friends, we take other things, and we make them our God. We take pieces of creation and deify them in our lives with our love and in our adoration. And Paul's going to talk about that a lot here in the next few chapters. But at the end of the day, when you choose to ignore the truth that God is who he said he is, and you substitute it with a lie, you learn to think in useless ways. And that results in a hardness of heart where you don't find the truth anymore. And I think you and I probably both would agree we see a lot of that kind of thinking in today's world. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, I hope this was helpful to you as you're starting to study the book of Romans. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, see you next week.